Hello everyone, today we look at one step that brought to the formation of the so-called modern armies, so approximately the establishment of a permanent corps of troops that fundamentally were not nearly close to the majority of the entire forces levied by these states were carrying out such reforms, and that, however, constitute, in fact, from the late Middle Ages onwards, and especially in countries like France and Burgundy, really the beginnings, right? Until the second half of the 17th century, you do not see, and you do not see in the sense that they would remain say the exception for still a while, such a thing like properly stateled national armies, so forces that were properly being levied in, say, even to the hundreds of thousands and maintained directly by the state and framed into regiments at that point that albeit still subcontracted to noblemen, and so maintaining a degree of private sort of nature, were still, in this sense, the reflection of the ancien regime, of the fact that this, was essentially the rule of a dynasty that had proven to be superior to the other aristocrats that, however, were cooperating as lords of various communities with the consent, juridically, of the latter to arm these men in a more centralized fashion, etc. So we will surely look at that objectively. Schwerpunkt tends, in, say, considering the average timeline, to stop exactly to the mid-17th century, but as you know, recently, especially this last spring, summer, I made a consistent amount of 18th, 19th century warfare, and I count on coming back on those centuries because they're really that formative and really useful to understand also a great part of what happened, in fact, in the last couple of 100 years to our very days. As a medievalist, however, I concentrate on medieval times, in fact, and in this case, in fact, looking at the beginning of the dynamic, the establishment of these forces. I made a video about the French bandes d'ordonnance that are basically indicated as the first true corps of troops of this kind maintained by the monarchy, as essentially any other company of already military professionals that, however, were regularly disbanded and or simply sent away, ready to stop being paid at the end of the season and or other times. Fundamentally, what starts happening with this bond is that they start being paid permanently, right, every year, right? But de facto, there, you see, in France, there was already a quite advanced statal, even bureaucratic dimension that favored the sort of even the documentary side to officialize historiographically even such event. But Philippe de Comines was quite close to this event and knew about military stuff, was pointing out the obvious, actually, that specifically those French bands were inspired to the Italian condottas and to the, generally speaking, just how companies had been regularly organized in other parts of Europe, such as, in fact, we look at Milan, at Venice, Florence, etc., even from the beginning of the 14th century. And that de facto constituted this, at that point I would call them semi-permanent, because in part it's not really documented how the thing worked, but what we see is that these forces were, in a way or another, readily available in the even several thousands of men-at-arms from that earlier in time. And of course, if you look at the same Kingdom of France, that was essentially the other major military power around, you see at comparable numbers in the same way, in the same period, right? So we should also get habituated, in fact, to this to the existence of the great medieval civilization in the heart of the Middle Ages, and the fact that this sort of positivistic and progressistic and whatever modern era, right, for which we say, oh, look, for the first time there were permanent forces, because in the Middle Ages they did not exist, whatever. It's just a pile of garbage, nothing more, nothing less. And yes, it's useful in terms of institutional history, in the sense that, of course, from the big crack of the 14th century, the way this great medieval civilization had shrank and eventually began to restructure on these new bases is valid, and you should study definitely modern warfare along this pattern, right? But the other important thing is that essentially these forces were established or recruited and again kept in pay together with other companies that were actually just instead disbanded at the end, and that constituted at that point the real bulk of the of most of early modern armies, right? Together still with militias, with feudal levies of any sort, but still maintaining fundamentally again until the mid 17th century this core of mercenaries, temporary ones. Then there's this sort of royal core or whatever that could be maintained just by the the sovereign, whatever. This is true even if you look at the masnate of the 10th of the 11th century. Like the seigneur has this retinue of thugs that fundamentally live in his house, right? It's just like the Norse herder, etc. in the Viking era. It's just the same mechanism, and so there had always been a core, even in the ancient war bands, of some sort of fully maintained, sort of permanent forces that at that point, in that sense, could have not remained like that, just because mostly it depended on the lifetime of the life length of their leader, and so we do not see much of the institution, but much of the way, in fact, in which ancient armies had been developing with more permanent sort of centralized armies had been practically the same that you start seeing here, with the only difference that again the 15th century is much better, more just documented than those previous times, in spite of the fact that this was a more timid phenomenon by scale compared to those great classical armies, right? So this is not the point. But today I want to focus specifically on Burgundy, the Burgundian state. Valois Burgundy. I made multiple videos about that already, but we haven't quite even began to see well in depth this aspect, with some cursory reflection on Spain and Italy, because quite interesting things were going on there. Just we will eventually conclude with some general consideration of how other armies in Europe kept on working still with fundamentally comparable quality, so that again it's a little thing that starts happening, and just the way war was fought was actually and organized, etc., was much more effective and efficient than we tend to think, in spite of the medieval modern dichotomy that has been somehow imposed on us. Essentially, was what you see during the modern ages, medieval. Also in this state, because they were born in the Middle Ages, not in the modern age. In any case, I'd say Burgundy is always an interesting topic, because it's also relatively controversial in the interpretation. Right? People rightfully speak of the prosperity of Burgundy and the, let's say, the chivalric standards of the same house. Much more complicated is to explain how this state, as it's called historiographically, came to be, because it's not just the Duchy of Burgundy there. As you know, there are the Netherlands, there are other territories scattered across France and the Holy Roman Empire. And it doesn't matter how great these rulers were and how famed their armies were, still they were not really on the atmosphere until the very end of their existence from a military point of view. There was a specific reason, right? We tend to say, France, look, they were being kicked in the rear throughout all the 100 Years' War. Yeah, but aside from the fact that they won that, but they were also a much bigger, more powerful system once the thing was put together once again. Burgundy was much more patched together, even in times of prosperity. And so this actually helps to explain a lot of what happened even with Charles the Bold, that we'll see in a while. First of all, let's in fact realize this, that of course armies cost, and the House of Burgundy had actually less abundant and especially less regular income than the Kingdom of France. Right? Doesn't matter whether Burgundy was actually much less threatened throughout the 14th, the 15th century than the same France, right, in terms of political, territorial stability, etc. I mean, the same Burgundy participated to the destruction of the French kingdom, that, however, never quite succeeded, nor it was fully the ultimate objective, because it was mostly a dynastic issue of substitution, but also literally of the structuration of the French Valois center of power. In any case, this lack of pressure, if you want, it was relative. Of course, Burgundy was pressured by many threats as well, but in general, I'd say the metus hostilis in Burgundy was much less than in France, right? And this series of factors caused essentially the much more traditional system permanence in the Burgundian armies, especially as far as the constitution of these forces was concerned. Less pressure, less need to update, to upgrade, to step up. So when you look at how the Burgundian army was organized, and if I'm not wrong, I made a video years ago, and in any case we have to cover still everything in detail, you see the typical medieval army, right? The vassal levy, city militias, right? And for which, at that point in history, for the length, the duration of the campaign, a certain amount of money was paid, right? And when you look at it, you realize that it was also the most sensible thing to do, because the result was satisfactory, right? Remember that in war, most of the times, what it's good enough is fine, right? If you manage to maintain control on your territories through these forces, after all, why would you, if you don't have any major threat on the longer run, etc., why should it? Because it already cost a lot the way it was, right? But of course, there were much more dramatic situations, including just west. But just to make an example of what the same Burgundians were facing, Philip the Good did not meet much of a difficulty to consolidate his domain at the expenses of the same Kingdom of France. His forces were deemed satisfactory to allow him to carry out a diplomatic initiative to deterrence towards the same Holy Roman Empire. The urban revolt in the Netherlands were repressed by the Burgundians. This is an aspect that actually should make reflect anyone who thinks that infantry warfare was anywhere as, you know, subverting the role of feudal armies, right? After Courtrai and Montpellier, the latter was not nearly even just the brilliant success of the first, and in that sense kind of last case, the Flemish armies of infantry troops suffered a striking as uninterrupted series of defeats until basically Guinnegat, when the Habsburgs brought a bit of Swiss contractors, but we're at the end of the 15th century itself. So essentially a season of total defeats that brought to the conquest of the lowlands at the hands of feudal cavalry-based armies, right? So the infantry revolution, my eyes, right? And this is particularly relevant exactly for the country that had basically scored at Courtrai the most important infantry victory of the early 14th century, after which you have to wait really for the mid-15th century and actually to the same Burgundian-Swiss wars, to see a reversal at that point, truly epical, right? And we opened there to essentially pike and shot warfare, even though the Swiss were just basically about pikes, but very different pikes to the one that everybody had ever used up to that point. Anyway, without being decisive, of course, against cavalry for the majority of time, right? This is particularly important to stress, right? And again, I made so many videos about this. If you search for late medieval infantry, how to debunk the myth of the infantry revolution, etc., just look at that, because it's actually one of my fields of research, and so I'm also quite proud in a way to destroy people's hopes about the sort of positivistic, deterministic mythologies, of course. But again, the Burgundians had really been a might to be reckoned with. I'm not saying. I just began the video by saying that even that they were just putting together different territories that historically between France and Germany had remained somehow fragmented, so they were somehow easy to conquer, but were also by themselves lacking the basis for a more compact statile reality that fundamentally would never quite form. Yes, Flanders received an important sense of national compaction by the efforts of administrative homogenization by the Valois, Burgundy, etc. But let's say those were definitely not, especially historical insight, terrestrial superpowers to rise, right? And so I made multiple videos on Lotharingia, even the previous centuries. But of course, these had been important territories as well for exactly this history of warfare. At the Battle of Montlhéry, where in 1465 the same Burgundian feudal cavalry had kept in check the regular companies of Louis XI of France. Right, I made a video about Louis XI and also a bit his Burgundian dilemma. But it's important to stress, of course, that aside from this permanentization, let's say, of the companies remained companies, right? It wasn't a specifically qualitative difference here that say, well, just because, I don't know, the French began to pay these forces earlier to be maintained, to remain just standing in the same unit, necessarily, right, those companies, those bands had to be better across this century fundamentally than other companies that could be also grizzled veterans, right? Just because you maintain some troops, as we'll see now, doesn't actually mean that they necessarily have also a greater training or experience of the others. I mean, tendentially, yes, because you're sort of binding these people to a lifetime profession, or one at least, in fact, in your own service. But this is the point. This is still, in many ways, the age of the indenture and the condotta, etc. So there is also a deep internationalization of warfare. So you find people of different nationality really serving here and there, different national styles. All right, as we will see now with Charles the Bold, you have, for example, the longbow spreading in a more consistent fashion, in part by English imitation, but also because Scotland, France had to come up with some sort of solution. Longbow had always existed everywhere in Europe. You have in the Burgundian armies of Charles the Bold, Englishmen, Germans, Italians. Everything was that mixed. Think about the styles here, right? How far does Milanese armor go, right? Also the Gothic style, and how you find it both pretty much everywhere. And so that definitely in the 15th century is really this, right? The 15th century witnesses the full surpassing of any sort of, this also from depends, of course, it's never an absolute total dynamic, but essentially there's no difference anymore, even in those minimal ethnical styles that had existed in the past centuries within European armies. They all fight pretty much in the same way, and especially when we talk about the companies. Now, when the Swiss come on the scene, it's everything is changing. But even from there on, that basically everybody starts imitating the Swiss, and so basically Western warfare does remain homogeneous along that pattern, in spite of this actually quite traumatic moment of also need of push of pressure of updating, etc., because it cost an enormous amount of money. And if you didn't invest in those military institutions, you would have been destroyed as a country, etc., as it happened, for example, to the Burgundian state. And this is not specifically what we're talking about now. We'll make hopefully many other videos about especially the Burgundian Swiss wars that are very important. Now, in fact, by that point, by the rise of Charles the Bold to the ducal throne, Burgundy needed, right, was perfectly aware of really needing much more updated systems. The ones standing were too archaic, right? It was difficult to homogenize feudal levies, again, urban militias, mercenary companies, etc. So something had to come together, had to be a sort of synthesis of sort. Charles the Bold, in particular, wanted to dispose of a military machine that would reunite within itself everything that had all the best, essentially, of the innovations and of the warlike traditions of the great Western states, right? And that's the reason, as we've seen, why there were also certain tactical styles from here and there. Charles the Bold's army was not so revolutionary as we think. It was, together with the Venetian condotte, as we will see now, essentially the finest army of its day, but it was also short-term time, right? Of course, it ended, in the Burgundian case, disastrously enough, but these were still armies essentially based on the company, in a way or another. And the attempt here was to glue these companies together through a mechanism that would hopefully render them more uniform, more loyal to the political cause, more reliable, more readily available, and thus also in part supplied and sort of maintained by the state. It's obvious that since the Burgundians were just the same Capetian dynasty, right? When you say Valois, it's just they were actually just the Valois branch of the Capetian dynasty, and the Valois Burgundy were the same royal house of France that had just decided to do this sort of bizarre thing. And it's obviously enough the strongest military model available was the one presented by the Kingdom of France, that at this point, after the end of the 100 Years' War and the French victory in it, of course, was fastly recompacting its armed forces and offered, in general, at that point, a very advanced, at least, institutional model. Again, the fact that the French had established the ordnance companies / bands, whatever, doesn't necessarily mean that these were sort of strongest forces ever fielded by anyone in this case, right? Tendentially, France as a power was that more powerful, but it doesn't mean that qualitatively this the case. Still, the standard was very high, to say the least. I mean, France, in this sense, had very few to envy to anyone at that point, and the Swiss had not really quite showed their newly reformed system yet. So the same Charles went by degrees, actually. These are not merely technical or tactical reforms. This is about properly it's a political reform regarding the military organization of the state. And the idea of having readily available semi-permanent troops, right, was the first objective. There was this transient experiment made up by the gage ménager, that is to say, some sort of half-paid reservists. That doesn't sound quite the best result, but it's a start. Essentially, you would have some troops that were be paid a decent amount just to be available in arms if called specifically, and if you don't give them, which means that they are actually paid in peacetime for that purpose, because the sense is that they should have provided with their own equipment given this pay, and that was, however, half in peacetime. Then there is the full recruitment of ordnance companies, just like along the French model, starting from the end of the year 1470. The Abbeville Ordinance of July the 31st, 1471, regularized thus a mechanism that had, as we've just seen, empirically developed, right, through the institution of an army of 1250 lances, which we do not know exactly how many troops were there counted, but given that the lances in this specific context it varied over time, but counted fundamentally 8 men, we're talking about roughly 10,000 fighters, right, and soldiers proper, because they were paid as such. In turn, this force was subdivided in a dozen companies, and I explained, I had to check actually which videos I made about the Burgundians, because some were from the very beginning of Schwerpunkt, so it's some years ago now. So if you want to check them, there is a medieval Burgundy playlist in the first place. I made something about the medieval formations, the battle order of Charles the Bold, Burgundian army, the Burgundian flags, Charles the Bold's Burgundian army organization. So yes, we have explained it. Importantly enough, Burgundian army dress. Then we made other videos specifically about the Burgundian state and the Swiss Confederacy in comparison, but it's not a strictly military one. In any case, we described there some dynamic that brought, in fact, to the Swiss victory over the ordnance companies of Charles the Bold. In any case, I will not digress now specifically on the functionment of these forces. Just bear in mind that when we talk companies, we're essentially looking at an organic unit that had come to establish itself numerically around, in this case, how much, 100 men, and that could vary, really. It had been the basis of essentially the mercenary band. You can draw a trade union with even the ancient war bands of some sort. During the 13th to 14th century, the companies had become sort of the bulk of European armies, because the feudal levy had failed. Made multiple videos about this topic. And some were, I don't know, of 20 men, and others of 500, right? You could have this great variation. Some companies, especially the Italian condottas, were sort of entire armies that given power paid for and just to use as their own armored force. But overall, right, at that point would have been something different. The single sort of core unit was the company one. It's the same one that remained essentially throughout the early modern age to eventually form the regiment. And so you lacked that sort of hierarchical glue to keep them together, but they were still the basis. In fact, here they were understood individually to be some sort of military presence, even garrison in peacetime in specific places. We've seen, especially in the video about the French army organization of this time. And they were tactically autonomous, right? So these 100 men, also because when we talk about lanks, we're talking about essentially the men-at-arms plus other a retinue fundamentally, right, of other specialized tactically specialized troops than some field aides, whatever. And they normally operated grouped according to tactical specialty. So it's not that the same ranks fought all together, right? The infantrymen went all with the infantrymen, that the men-at-arms, often on horseback, but not necessarily, had that specific heavy role, right? So that's how simple the system had been developing itself from quite a long time, right? Because originally these lances were just the men-at-arms. That wasn't much. There was a retinue following, but they weren't so tactically specialized as it occurs in the 15th century. It's a bit the peak of this system that we can't say reached its extremization properly in the Burgundian army, because the idea was having this ever more complete, right, well-paid, well-equipped lances that had also to stick together and increase that sort of, even through uniforms provided by the state, etc., that sense of compactness in the absence of something else, right? The Swiss came up with something actually much simpler, but traumatically more brutal, and also more costly in that regard, in terms of individual participation, right? But in fact, this was also a political and social problem of one of Burgundy, and it gets down to moral forces in many ways. It's not that the Burgundian armies were bad, right? Of course, when you look at all the various defeats that they suffered, you start thinking, well, there was maybe something not really working there, but overall, they were, at least organically speaking, the same of other European armies. So, independently from Charles and various political issues, the factions, bad luck too. Well, it's obvious that the Swiss model was something else. It had an edge, or at least it earned it on the battlefield, and eventually that would be the future properly. But again, we're not talking this today specifically. The Bohain-en-Vermandois ordinance, dated to November the 13th, 1472, contemplated 1,200 lances with 3 horses each, 3,000 archers, 600 mounted crossbowmen, 2,000 pikemen, 1,000 foot archers, and 600 culverniers. Right, this gives you also, we will have similar information about the Burgundian organic. It tells you also in terms of tactical segmentation. I was talking to you about right now what this thing really was about. Understand, it's essentially a strongly cavalry-based army, right? You do have a substantial number of missile and a few pikemen after all, which, independently from this reform, so you see the total, first of all, is 10,000 men in all, so this was somehow typical, right, of these Burgundian forces. The human material was practically the same of previous times, likely. So it wasn't much, again, a tactical or doctrinal, to be anachronistic sounding change. It was rather, right, there were experiments on that ground, but often these troops were eventually deployed in much more orthodox and simpler ways than we usually think, right? Then how a normal Burgundian army had fundamentally been in the previous century, aside from, the new, here we see the culverniers, etc., other sort of types of troops that had not been so frequent like before, like longbowmen. Still, however, it's a pretty typical late medieval army after all, right? We've seen in the Burgundian ordinances before certain battles how the Burgundians were in their sort of war council toying with ideas of different battle arrays, in certain cases very complicated ones that I also drew myself to explain. One of the first video I listed before are the ones I made on the Burgundians, that we know eventually from the actual battle descriptions were never actually employed, right? And there is a lot in this sense about the geometry, the concept, like a Eumenian sort of idea, when we actually realize that these battles were also very orthodox in nature, right? Battle lines were simply drawn in simple, in fact, but effective ways, right? So the idea that, of course, late medieval Europe, especially in the 15th century, was beginning to toy with even military treaties with some sort of more theoretical insight, in many ways had, as we have explained multiple occasions, very few to do with the actual adherence of those ideas to the actual art of war of the time. They're an aspect of it, a theoretical reflection on it, but still, more concretely, this is just a normal late medieval army. This sense of having heavy cavalry accompanied by missile troops and poor infantry overall, it's typical since the mid-14th century, right? It's just the norm. Before that, there was more infantry, telling the truth. In fact, also those infantry armies that defeated other standard forces in the first half of the 14th century were also fairly small, right? They weren't part also of a military reform or whatever. They were just spontaneous peasant or bourgeois rebellious forces that fought essentially what they had and as on foot. So nothing cerebrally categoristic or mechanistic. It's just war. It's how much you want to kill the person in front of you, basically, that really matters. Then we see other Burgundian ordinances, such as the one of Saint Maximin of Trier, 1473, the one of Lausanne in 1476. These brought two relevant changes in the troop organization, in the command hierarchy, importantly enough, also in equipment, in military training, military exercise, both individually and collectively, right? So obviously they were aiming towards the right direction, right? But again, the forces remain pretty much the same, 10,000 fighting men. And we're not even completely sure about that, because some troops were also, again, mostly auxiliary in nature, but still, okay, they fought. Of course, the Burgundian ordnance companies were practically cancelled with the death of Charles the Bold himself at the disastrously final Battle of Nancy, and by the political turmoil that followed from the succession crisis with Mary. We've seen it, of course, mostly because of the Habsburgic connection, the sort of the end of the Burgundian state. I mean, the partition of the same between France and the Empire. However, it's worth noticing in this sense, also in terms of biological continuity, that once the dominion of the Archduke Philip the Fair, the son, in fact, of Mary of Burgundy and Emperor Maximilian, in a relatively few years, the same ordinances are reborn. Naturally on a more modest scale, because the Habsburgs had most of their forces reorganized in Germany. The Landsknecht, and we have seen them in multiple videos, of course, were a creation of Maximilian. And they were recruited essentially along the Swiss model fundamentally, or at least they were soon trained like that. As we've seen at the Ginnegat, the Habsburgs even tried to carry out a sort of military reform of what they had inherited factually of the Burgundian state, that is the Netherlands, but those countries were again mostly made up of communes that were not of towns really, that had not that sort of statal gluing factor. They they just traditionally remained quite autonomous. They had provided with militias, with guns especially, but they were not to field thousands of men forming in pike squares and with the necessary as quite costly training, right, for achieving the collective effectiveness. So they, at the Guinegats, the French were halted, but that's as far as it went, like as far as the local reform eventually, or the possibility of reviving the ordinances, aside from saying, okay, well, yes, armies still worked by companies, but other than the say Charles the Bold's legacy and the just natural as gradual development of armies in late medieval Europe, they were again pretty standard companies in some ways. This was possible, of course, only when, by the way, the administrative and settled mechanisms that had been founded by the Dukes of Valois Burgundy were reactivated, right? But again, the Habsburgs were not even particularly committed, or especially committed to that front only, so they were driven elsewhere. And that's also why it's important to observe same Spain, where Philip the Fair also ruled. And in there, of course, Spain had an important tradition prior to this point, but it was also a feudal one, right? Castile was the most powerful of the realms inherited by the Habsburgs, and the backbone of that world was very rural, very feudal, very nobiliar in nature. There was a tendency to evaluate infantry perhaps a bit more, but on a social level. It's not before Gonzalo de Cordoba in the Italian wars that, with the Battle of Cerignola specifically, then pike and shot, so it was properly the surpassing of the same Swiss model, aside from the debacle of Marignano, of the Albions, was established, right? It was an intuition that had not been fully grasped, right, by the Iberian rulers just by themselves. There were the Rodeleras, there were other, again, forces that still had were fresh from the recent fight against the last Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula. Some of these guys would go to exercise themselves in the Americas. But of course, what happened on the Western European battlefields was the most important thing in terms of military development. Spain, especially after the dynastic sum of Castile and Aragon, the Aragon I made a video about the Crown of Aragon. They had, of course, an important force, but mostly they were a maritime dominion in many ways, and the various communities making it up were also a bit jealous of their own autonomies. They didn't like to pay too much, were sort of more mercantile oriented, so it was really Castile that led this process of the establishment of a regular army. Right, this was deemed rightfully indispensable, so much so that Antoine de Lalaing, who was essentially an official in the Netherlands that was naturally connected to the Habsburgs with Spain at this point, tells us that during his travel in Spain with Philip the Fair in 1501-02, Isabel of Castile, quote, had 3,000 men-at-arms in ordinance to her pay, and 4,000 men-at-arms that were at disposal in their own houses, half paid. Right, so it's what we've seen before. They began with paying them not for the full service, but in order to remain essentially as reservists ready to be summoned once again and to have enough equipment for that purpose, or paid at home This is important because, of course, there were no barracks, nothing, so these people were billeted literally in the local communities, also for strategic reasons. We've seen it well in France during the English chevauchée, having these companies stationed in a given town that also essentially supplied them through some also royal help, was a way to literally garrison the same city against the enemy attacks, right? So everything does really, but eventually you have this sort of local organization and you want to capitalize on it. And then you have 3,000 men at arms that were instead always available, because just the Queen of Castile needed always this force. 3,000 men at arms was sort of the basis for every decent field army, right? The standard. Then of course she would hire other troops, she would levy other militias, whatever. She would receive allied help, etc. But she needed this core, right, of men at arms always available for any campaign, right, and essentially working as the backbone of the royal army. And it makes a lot of sense. Plus, again, this reserve of even a larger amount of men. As Lalande says, the reservists, the half-pay ones, were always ready to serve in wars. As soon as she would have called them, they would have, at that point, received the entire pay, as we've seen. So it makes a lot of sense. The half-pay was in peacetime, but they needed their pay also in the full pay during the war, because they would have not served otherwise. This is not much of a technical problem. This is a political problem, a social problem. These people want to know how to fight. They just need the reason to, in many ways. And consider that the alternative, still at this point, was to be hired by, say, another, a nobleman privately, or another country even. So it's pretty relevant. But it's becoming safer for the same guys to make a living, which was also, by the way, this pays were not making them live in a luxurious condition, right? But again, given the market of war, it was a good pay. And there were other bonds, naturally, of loyalty that we cannot simply digress on, because I guess the money speak by themselves. Looking at Italy, this is also particularly interesting, because we tend to think that, say, the condotta system, as because of all the Black Legion that has been sown around it, would have been, even prevented, actually, would have hampered the development of true and proper permanent armies to the direct dependencies of the Italian regional states. This is, of course, not true, as Philippe de Comines was actually saying himself, right? The same idea of the ordnance companies had started from the remarkably large amount of men-at-arms that the Italian lordships had been hiring on a regular basis since the beginning of the 14th century. And that were basically, if you look at that period, the Milanese or the Scaliger seigneury, right? Literally the largest armies in Europe, together with the French one. And we easily see it on a numerical basis, and this was completely normal. So that if from one side you see that you could never give too much for granted the loyalty of the condottieri, after all, the need to grant the security and the defense of fortresses through the same condottieri that had obviously something to gain from it themselves in terms of pay, in terms of political connections, etc., overlapped to a significant degree. For example, the Venetian Senate in 1421 declared that it was always of their policy to dispose of men of valor both in peace and in wartime, right? And this is exactly what had been happening with the companies that they hired they had hired, and that, for example, at some point could remain without a condottiere, that sometimes could serve for a lifetime, and eventually pass away. But these forces, having been organized de facto as sort of mini stattal armies on their own, that were actually as large as stattal ones of entire kingdoms, would on some occasions, this is especially the case for the Venetian one, it was very well organized again, that they would simply remain at that point at the dependency of Venice, right? After all, if the condottiere had gotten the money from these powers, like why wouldn't the soldiers working for him should just stop receiving that? And so there was this practice, especially starting from the mid-15th century. So you see the acceleration exactly in the same years in numerous Italian states, and the most powerful ones, so the most reigning Republic of Venice, Milan, and also the Kingdom of Naples, the regular maintenance of armed forces to their direct dependencies, known as lanze spezzate, which in Italian stands for broken lances. And so the idea that they had been somehow, again, remain orphaned by that of their previous military entrepreneurs, and now they were simply passing to the control of the local fully, because they had already been de facto, but in a more, in fact, formal, institutionalized way of the local states, as de facto semi-permanent, but not properly permanent forces, right? And again, this aspect of the permanence is quite fascinating, because again, during the 14th and 15th century, given the peak of professionalism and probably the peak of companies' warfare, right? What does exactly permanent or semi-permanent means, right? It's just about fundamentally who pays you, not much whether you are standing or not. It is true that some companies, of course, were disbanded properly at some point, especially in the earlier periods, during, look at the Treaty of Bretigny and all the troops that came to Italy at some point. So, but everywhere, really, a certain number of troops could be summoned. They could be moving even from previous army organization to say, okay, let's go this place, and then at some point, okay, we're done here, and they disbanded and even came back home, right? In fact, one of the most interesting things of this is that unlike there's a lot about the migration era in this dynamics, right? If you look at the avalanche of German mercenaries, there were really a lot of them. We're talking of tens of thousands of forces. They're not irrelevant, especially considering that they're mostly of men-at-arms, so not just a random guy with a pike or something, but they evidently don't settle. They're not absorbed by foreign countries. They do not actually invade one place and receive this in fief. No, they remain alienated, right? The crisis bits hard pretty much everyone, and at the end of the day, it's states that remain standing and manage to expel or co-opt these guys. And after all, they had come to these places just because local powers had been throwing them against one another, not really deciding to go there for no reason. Also considering that they could find a good pay after all. So even though especially the Renaissance and Romanticism has sort of created this dark legend about the mercenaries and the soldiers of fortune, etc. Really, the 14th or 15th century, nothing different from what you see in the previous ones. I also made a bit about medieval mercenaries recently, and they weren't really doing much worse things than they were doing habitually, right? At best, there is a generalized crisis, and it's intrinsic in the same political and social structures. I mean, even the fact that these people went for this lifestyle out there was the symptom of a crisis. If they had found a better way of living, at home, they would have not done so, right? So, of course, in any time there were mercenaries, there still are abundantly, but say the degree, of course, by which they impacted the world at the time was, say, going up and down. This was, especially 14th century, a moment of up, right? But as you see in the 15th century, you have that model that, however, is becoming institutionalized, formalized, essentially regularized again. And this heads towards essentially more orderly, modern organization of these armies. So I think it's particularly important. Thus, the appearance of permanent armies was paradoxically reinforcing tendencies and characteristics that had already been existing. Troops maintained in a place because they were needed for a certain amount of time. At this point, simply becomes officially, say, fixed, right? And with lots of different changes still, because of course the companies that were established in the 15th century are not literally the same ones you can trace, right, throughout the early modern age continuously, right? It's just with the birth of regiments that you really have a full continuity of, you start seeing actually, because they could be disbanded as well, a full institutional historical continuity, historical units still to this day in our armies. But this, in fact, mechanism was not so definitive even at the time, the way we described it today. This went in parallel, however, with all the practical needs required to maintain these forces. For example, the elaboration of military codes in ever more complex forms, the increase in collective training, both of the men-at-arms and the other troops. There is especially the need, especially with the Swiss that are really going with an extra gear there, establishing a much greater, much more intense drill, marching at pace, performing complex maneuvers, passing from column to line, etc., changing front, etc. There were still primitive ways of fighting, after all, considering the intensity to which they would escalate in the following centuries. But they were exactly the beginning of that new level, right? More frequent at this point for so many psychological, tactical, and even supplies purpose was the use of uniforms, distinctive signs, badges. Made lots of videos about this recently. The one about the English livered retainer, exactly of the 15th century. This was, of course, important for also showing better what military hierarchy was about, right? Before, these armies had been put together just like how many companies do we have, right? Let's cram them all together in different battle lines and then it will go. Now, everything was sort of more orderly and pre-established, also in the way these forces should interact with one another. Pennants, standards, banners of the Burgundian army, made a video on that. I also recently made a more general one to explain the various types of flags, let's say. This contributed to the birth of sort of civilization of military camps, right, with its rites, its distractions, its spectacles. I mean, 16th century literature especially is very iconic about this, right? This new soldiery, a soldiery that starts spreading properly, also considering the larger armies needed and sort of the greater grip of governments on this importantly consolidated realms on a national basis. We've seen it well in the video about the Landsknecht, and the sense of the soldier being now sort of a guy that can exist between the nobility and between the misery of the peasantry, not managing actually to overthrow the ancien regime, right? And actually the Landsknecht then declining, the Swiss as well, the French not wanting actually to establish such potentially subversive soldiery that at home could cause a revolution or something. In any case, you understand that this would become the basis of also the military subjection, right, of the soldier. I made a video recently. And a soldier that was, however, recognized as sort of a different element within society, whereas before in the Middle Ages, a bit everyone was militarized, if you want. Some more, some less, especially in these later centuries. The gap between the soldiery and the rest of the people had increased, and remarkably so. But now the ancien regime was consolidating, solidifying further. In fact, I made recently a video about the Protestant influence in the increase of military discipline, right? This sort of you have to self-sacrifice just because, right? With the Protestant ethos basically saying that works are worthless, so you just have to live through this and you don't have to even question, right? And so abating further that sense of individualism that was instead more proper of the Middle Ages as such. So modernity did pass through this different path, right? It's somehow ironic, as we observed in the last video, that the Protestants would resume earlier the practice of uniforming, even though this had been medievally typical of Catholic culture, the various orders, and because there was a sort of an ascetic militarization in that regard, monastic lifestyle, level up again of self-sacrifice and deprivation that had not been seen before. Now the state was becoming more powerful, and they could do that. They could go ever harsher with the iron fist. The Burgundian army was displaying especially this high, sometimes even properly excessive, if it was ever eventually achieved, because we have this normative dispositive sources, but we do not know exactly what an army would look like on the field. Yes, we have beautiful illuminated manuscripts, etc., but we didn't have a camera there to film what happened for us to see. And yes, this sense of hyper-uniformation, knowing exactly in this big armies, all specialized in this way and crammed together what everyone had to do at any given time. Probably, again, everything was much simpler, and this was really done mostly like a psychological exercise to boost the sense of duty and esprit de corps and sort of allegiance to the cause, etc. Evidently, in the Burgundian army, this was unsatisfactory. This model was defeated by the Swiss, that again had a much less artificial sense of community, and that also, however, were a bit too anti-statal eventually to succeed as a power on their own against the French, the Germans, the Spanish, that implemented the system further and added to it, of course, pike and shot. And again, with an ever greater subjection of the average soldier to the system, right? Not like a Swiss farmer soldier that was fighting, knowing his guys and so on. Even though that cantonal division was sort of preventing the further compaction of power and so the development of further army, right? If at Marignano the Swiss had not been defeated, it would have taken Milan, and probably also the wealth of Switzerland would have really not existed historically, because they would have concentrated on northern Italy instead, in a sense that bath of blood is also what made Switzerland a successful nation today, still within its role, let's say, its mount, but you gotta appreciate them, of course. So when you look around the year 1500, you realize that there is a lot going on. Today we do not really address how much of a hurry actually existed because of the aforementioned international pressure and threats. France was again had swallowed basically the most important parts of Burgundy. It had compacted. Now all the other powers are freaking out. The Italian wars began, and so that was a fierce struggle that, if you want to continue it ever and ever, you have the French Confessional Wars, then you have Louis XIV again, and we start again. So that's what a different sort of shoulder hits, like kind of shakes the entire system to improve, right? So people want to call it modern Europe, right? It's far from that, right? It's the attempt of a monarchy to concentrate ever greater power without ever being absolute. The only absolutistic phase is the one of the state as sole source of law from the Code Napoleon, and so that would take quite a while. But definitely between, in fact, this time, the end of the Middle Ages, and Napoleon, you have this great expansion that passed through this mechanism, after all, step by step, with extreme pain and blood spitting and tear sweating, but so also through these massacres in open field and not. So again, consider that the various communities of these realms were not really prepared even to all this. They were contributing actively to the strengthening of authority. They understood that this system was better to pay to have competent troops led by the state to safeguard the realm, but this cost a lot. They were not real and true barracks, so these communities had to pay for the building of the troops, as we've seen. These troops were still largely, again, made up of free companies that were quite unruly sometimes and not attached to the local customs, so you do not have true traceability even, right? There was no such thing like permanent infantry or artillery regiments. These people were just brought together most of the times, and they flocked from different parts of Europe, also as locusts, to just ravage these places. Think about the 30 Years' War and more. Also, and this is particularly important at the time, in spite of the triggering of this broader development, the initial need to have such kind of reforms was not immediately pressing and sort of necessarily, desirable from anyone, right? First of all, vast areas of Europe would remain still, in a feudal condition for centuries, right? But also importantly developed countries, for example, England, resisted in an obstinate way to the institution of new military structures. Now, part of the reason is that England, of course, was a bit out of the games at this point, after the end of the 100 Years' War and the War of the Roses. The English system sort of starts lagging behind compared to the continental developments. Ironically, because in fact, up to the previous centuries, we've seen that the English armies were basically they were the strongest in history in condition of symmetry, right? Meaning that France and England were pretty much the same material culture during the 100 Years' War. There is no practical difference in the potential you could field in tactical sense, and yet if you look at the repeated victories of the English armies through essentially after the reform of Edward III, we can say, of the Edwards, like all of three of them. There's no other army in history that scored that hit in a row, right? So that's really a premise that must be considered, but this is exactly the proof, right? They even lost the war, and after that they began to lag behind. So it's how, let's say, contextual these things must be understood, and not just because this was the strongest army. And of course England, in spite of this, still remained fundamentally an efficient military force for substantial time, meaning that up to the mid-16th century, essentially the English forces, even if still preferring longbows to the shot, and having this still more feudal organization compared to the pike and shot system of the continent, were not in fact so different after all from that model still, because things were gradually accelerating, but still at the beginning, before ingraining, that you could still see in the odds of war a balanced situation. Right after that, in the second half of the 16th century, the first half of the 17th, until the new model army, really England instead starts seriously lagging behind on land. Right, at sea it's a different story, but this systemic aspect must be considered. Now, why did England do so? Because of course they didn't need it. They didn't need it because they were surrounded by the sea, and of course there were threats from the same Britain, but and still from the same continent. Of course they could cross that sea, but still they could invest in something else to try to not to spend too much fundamentally, and there are also other reasons. England was not so statally oriented like France. It was still more archaic under some points of view, and so this explains well also how much moral forces, when combined and dissolved, sort of give different results, even independently from specific state building, right? But the future was towards the latter, in fact, and after all, the same English Civil War was triggered by this point, right? The ship money was needed for war, for having a decent army, and if this army had not existed up to that point, it was just basically a rusty militia of some sort. The same English economy was blocked, right, to the same wool exports of medieval times. So everything had to change in a more traumatic way, and there you see it happening. And also in a paradoxical way, because for not paying the ship money at the end of the day, the Parliament took over by making, by the end of the century, of course, the country paying for another 10 times more that same money, but understanding civilization, of course, that now a true professional, costly, efficient, modern army had to be levied, and so the British Empire began. So you see how tortuously but still logic history is. Now, there is also another aspect that is, in this sense, this more sort of backward contexts were not considered sort of inferior in absolute terms, right? While the massive pike squares and increasingly supported by shot that would become the standard combined arm tactics throughout the modern age were dominating, of course, the most important battlefields and consequently politics and states in Western Europe, still it was not easy, say, to, take on the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, right? Or for the Ottomans to simply subdue the Transylvanians. It doesn't matter how archaic these systems were, given their political and territorial situation, they could afford to remain backward, also because they didn't really have the resources. This is yet another point. I mean, England eventually was to find those resources abroad, so hence the navy, etc. to the colonies. So everybody found, say, expanded in the direction that they could, but some simply even couldn't more than much. We've seen how there is a video I made, I think, about the 30 years army organization. To see how in Germany there was, I don't know, a very big variety of by the 30 years war, there were essentially countries like Saxony that had a feudal army still, right? While, of course, other states fit into a more advanced model. In that case, at least we talk the Habsburgs, the Catholics, the Spanish influence, then the Protestants were forming some, let's say, the most entrepreneurial ones, such as the Dutch, the Swedes, were inventing something else. The latter also with French money that was also doing something else. And so everything is really depending on so many different factors that, however, all tend towards a particular direction. And I think this is the beauty of history and the beauty of civilization. And you see the pattern even when things get ever more complicated to explain. And so you should never think that history is only getting ever more complicated so that you can't say we do not know because it's too complicated to do that. The more you enter into details, actually, the better you see the whole. And that's what we actually don't do too much anymore, because at least we see the details just of one system and not the others, right? So you must be actually very, very thorough and complete about this analysis to even set the premises right. So that's why I make all these videos, and why they are so long, because I'm searching at least for this specifically, and I hope not to disappoint excessively. But this is it. I'm glad that recently we made multiple videos about 15th century warfare. I think we needed a bit more of that. Let's say actually we need it for every century. Some really are not adequately covered, but it's I think it's good when you start having so many different videos for especially every century, so that you can, if you want to start, I always say that there are lots of playlists and people do not really watch them because they don't search for them anymore. They just click on what is suggested by YouTube. But if you dig, like if you search my Schwerpunkt 15th century, this is for every medieval century, I think, or maybe just the early medieval ones I didn't create a playlist yet for, but you can start seeing so many different facets of this period, and starting to reflect on the comparative nature of this wall. I think this is one of the single most relevant aspects of my content, and I hope it can serve this degree, right? Well, very well. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.